The cold crack of a pistol echoed through the valley as Willow Jensen ducked beneath her kitchen table. Her trembling fingers pressed against her lips to stifle a scream. Outside, the spring evening of 1876 had turned from peaceful to perilous in an instant, and she knew her husband Frank would soon burst through the door, his eyes wild with rage and whiskey. In the 3 years since she'd married Frank Jensen, Willow had learned to predict his moods like farmers predicted storms by the distant rumbling that signaled approaching danger. Tonight's danger had arrived in the form of another lost poker game at the Red Ace Saloon, which meant bruises would follow as surely as thunder follows lightning. She was 24 now, hardly recognizable as the hopeful young woman who had married Frank at 21, believing his promises of a good life in Genoa, Nevada. The promising cattle ranch they'd settled on had slowly fallen into disrepair as Frank's drinking worsened, and with it, his temper. The door crashed open, hinges protesting as Frank stormed in, tracking mud across the wooden floor Willow had scrubbed clean that morning. "Where are you hiding, woman?" he growled, kicking a chair aside. "Lost everything tonight because you're bad luck. Always have been." Willow crawled backward, seeking the shadows in the corner of their small ranch house. Maybe if she stayed quiet enough, he would pass out before finding her. It wouldn't be the first time whiskey had been her savior. "I said, where are you?" His voice dropped to that dangerous, quiet tone that frightened her more than his shouting. "I'm here, Frank," she finally answered, slowly standing from her hiding place. Better to face him than risk angering him further. "Would you like some coffee?" "I could." His hand shot out, gripping her wrist with bruising force. "Coffee? You think coffee is what I need right now?" He yanked her forward, his breath hot and sour against her face. "What I need is a wife who doesn't bring a man nothing but misfortune." "Please, Frank," she whispered, her blue eyes wide with fear. "You're hurting me." "Hurting you?" He laughed bitterly. "You don't know what hurt is." But she did know. She knew the precise pain of a closed fist, the sting of an open palm, the terror of being thrown against furniture. She knew the shame of explaining away bruises to the concerned shopkeepers in town, and the hollow emptiness of lying awake beside a man who had promised to cherish her, but only seemed to despise her existence. As Frank raised his hand, Willow closed her eyes, bracing herself. But the blow never came. Instead, 3 sharp knocks sounded at the door. Frank froze, his hand suspended in mid-air. "Who the hell is that at this hour?" The knocks came again, more insistent this time. "Don't you move," Frank hissed, releasing her wrist and moving toward the door, one hand hovering near the pistol on his hip. He flung the door open to reveal a tall figure silhouetted against the moonlight. A man in a dusty hat, his shoulders broad beneath a worn leather duster. "Evening," came a deep voice, calm as still water. "Name's Wade Evans. My horse threw a shoe about a mile back, wondering if you might have a place for me to bed down till morning." Willow peered around Frank's shoulder, taking in the stranger. His face was partially shadowed by his hat, but she could make out a strong jawline dusted with stubble and eyes that seemed to catch the moonlight. "We ain't running a hotel," Frank spat, his words slurring slightly. "Town's 3 miles that way." He jerked his thumb over his shoulder. "I'd be obliged for just a corner of your barn," the stranger Wade continued, seemingly unperturbed by Frank's hostility. "Happy to pay for the trouble." He reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out 2 silver dollars, holding them out in his gloved palm. Frank's demeanor shifted instantly at the sight of money. "Well now, that's different," he said, taking the coins and pocketing them. "Barn's out back. Help yourself." "Much appreciated," Wade replied, tipping his hat slightly. His eyes moved past Frank to meet Willow's for just a moment. Something in that gaze, a silent acknowledgement, perhaps made her heart skip a beat. As Frank closed the door, Willow quickly moved to the stove, busying herself with the coffee pot, hoping the distraction of the stranger would diffuse Frank's rage. "Lucky timing for you," Frank muttered, dropping heavily into a chair. "Go take a blanket out to the barn. Man paid good money." Willow nodded, relieved at the reprieve. She gathered a worn but clean blanket from the chest, filled a tin cup with hot coffee, and added a slice of bread and cheese to a plate. "What are you doing that for?" Frank demanded. "Man paid for a place to sleep, not for you to wait on him." "It's just being neighborly, Frank," she said softly. "It's cold tonight," Frank grunted, already pouring himself a whiskey from the bottle he'd brought home. "Fine, but you come straight back. No dallying." Willow slipped out into the cool night air, the items clutched to her chest. The barn door was ajar, a soft golden light from a lantern spilling out into the darkness. She hesitated, then pushed the door open with her foot. Wade Evans was brushing down his horse, a handsome chestnut gelding with a white blaze. He looked up as she entered, straightening to his full height, at least a head taller than Frank, with a leanness to him that spoke of hard work rather than hard drinking. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "That's mighty kind of you." "It's nothing," she replied, setting down the items on a hay bale. "I'm sorry about my husband. He's not himself tonight." Wade's eyes, a clear, perceptive green she could now see, studied her face carefully. "Is that so?" She became suddenly aware of the bruise forming on her wrist where Frank had grabbed her, and she tugged her sleeve down to cover it. But not before Wade's gaze flickered to it, his expression hardening slightly. "I should get back," she said quickly. "Of course." He nodded, but as she turned to leave, he added quietly, "Madam, what's your name?" She paused at the door. Willow Jensen." "Thank you for the kindness, Mrs. Jensen," he said, his voice warm in a way that made her feel noticed, truly seen for the first time in years. She hurried back to the house, where Frank had, mercifully, passed out in his chair, the half-empty bottle clutched to his chest. Carefully, she removed his boots and covered him with a quilt, then retreated to their bedroom, locking the door behind her, a small act of defiance she allowed herself on nights like these. As she lay in bed, staring at the shadows dancing across the ceiling, Willow couldn't stop thinking about the stranger in her barn. There had been something in his eyes, concern, perhaps, or understanding, something that made her feel less alone in a way she hadn't felt in a very long time. Morning came with the crowing of the rooster and the soft glow of dawn seeping through the thin curtains. Willow rose early, as was her habit, and moved quietly through the house. Frank was still passed out in his chair, snoring heavily. She started the coffee and mixed biscuit dough, then slipped outside to collect eggs from the henhouse. The air was crisp and clean, promising a beautiful day. As she rounded the corner of the barn, she nearly collided with Wade, who was leading his horse out into the yard. "Oh!" she gasped, clutching her egg basket to steady herself. "I'm sorry, I didn't see you." "No harm done," he said with a smile that transformed his serious face, creating lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often. "I was hoping to thank you before I left." "You're heading out so early?" she asked, then flushed at her forwardness. "Best to get to town and see about that shoe for Thunder here," he said, patting his horse's neck. "Unless there might be work around here. I'm handy with tools, good with livestock." Willow hesitated. The ranch did need help. Frank had let so much go to ruin these past years. But the thought of Frank's reaction to another man working their land, especially one who had witnessed their private shame, made her stomach knot with anxiety. "I don't think my husband would. 3 days' work," came Frank's voice from behind them, making Willow jump. He stood on the porch, looking haggard and irritable in the morning light. Fence on the north pasture needs mending. Roof on the chicken coop leaks. Pays $3 for the lot. Wade considered this, his expression unreadable. Make it 4 with meals and you've got yourself a hand for the week. Frank spat into the dirt. $3.50, and you sleep in the barn. Done, Wade agreed, extending his hand. Frank reluctantly shook it, then turned back into the house without another word. Willow stood frozen, uncertain what had just happened. Frank never hired help, preferring to let work go undone rather than spend money on labor. Looks like I'll be staying on a bit, Wade said quietly, leading Thunder toward the water trough. Hope that's not an inconvenience, Mrs. Jensen. No, she replied softly. No inconvenience at all. Over the next few days, a strange rhythm developed on the Jensen ranch. Wade worked from sunrise to sunset, repairing what years of neglect had broken. Frank, surprisingly, kept mostly to himself, riding out early to town or to check the cattle, returning late and keeping his drinking confined to the porch rather than bringing his rage inside. Willow found herself watching Wade as he worked. There was a quiet competence to him, a steadiness that drew her eye. He never complained about the heat or the difficult conditions of the neglected ranch. He simply worked with a purpose that made her wonder about his story. On the third day, as she brought him water while he mended the chicken coop roof, she finally found the courage to ask, "Mr. Evans, where are you from, if you don't mind me asking?" Wade sat back on his heels, wiping his brow with his sleeve before accepting the ladle of water. "Colorado originally. Been drifting since the war." "The war," she echoed, thinking of the great conflict that had divided the nation over a decade ago. He nodded, his eyes taking on a distant look. "Fought for the Union. Was barely 18 when I enlisted. Came back changed like most men did." He handed the ladle back to her. "Tried settling down once or twice, but the memories have a way of following you." "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Don't be," he replied, his smile returning. "Each day gets a little easier, especially with good honest work and—" He hesitated, then finished, "kind company." Their eyes met, and Willow felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. She quickly looked away, busying herself with the water bucket. "Your husband," Wade said carefully, "he always been quick to anger." The question startled her. No one had ever asked so directly before. The townspeople whispered, of course, but maintained the polite fiction that the bruises were accidents, that the Jensen marriage was merely going through difficult times. Frank wasn't always. She began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. "The drought 2 years ago hit us hard. We lost half our cattle. Then his father passed and the drinking got worse and—" She trailed off, the familiar excuses sounding hollow even to her own ears. Wade was quiet for a long moment. "No hardship justifies a man raising his hand to his wife, Mrs. Jensen." She felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them away quickly. "I should get back to the washing," she said, retreating toward the house. That evening, Frank returned from town in a dark mood. He'd lost at cards again, and the familiar pattern began to unfold as he paced the kitchen, finding fault with everything: the saltiness of the stew, the staleness of the bread, the way Willow looked at him like he was nothing. "I work myself to the bone for this place," he ranted, slamming his hand on the table. "And what do I get for it? A wife who can't even cook a decent meal." Willow kept her eyes down, saying nothing, knowing from experience that any defense would only fuel his rage. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, she was acutely aware of Wade Evans just outside in the barn, probably able to hear every word through the thin walls. The shame of it burned hotter than any pain Frank had ever inflicted. When Frank grabbed her arm and yanked her toward him, the plate she was drying clattered to the floor, shattering. She closed her eyes, waiting for the blow. Instead, the door opened, and Wade's calm voice cut through the tension. "Evening, folks. Sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to let you know I fixed that broken wagon wheel. Should hold now." Frank released Willow immediately, straightening up and clearing his throat. "Good, that's good." Wade stood in the doorway, his tall frame nearly filling it. His expression was neutral, but his eyes moved deliberately between Frank and Willow, noting her trembling hands and the broken dish at her feet. "Anything else you need me to look at before tomorrow?" Wade asked, his question directed at Frank but his eyes steady on Willow. "No," Frank muttered, moving to pour himself another drink. "We're turning in. Early start tomorrow." Wade nodded. "Mrs. Jensen, I noticed the garden fence needs some work. Rabbits getting at your vegetables. I could fix that first thing." "That would be fine, Mr. Evans," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good night, then," Wade said, touching his hat before stepping back outside. The interruption had broken Frank's momentum. He drained his glass, muttered something about needing air, and stalked out to the porch. Willow quickly cleaned up the broken dish, her hands still shaking. Later that night, after Frank had fallen into a drunken sleep, she crept to the window and looked out toward the barn. A faint light still glowed inside, and she could make out Wade's silhouette as he sat on a hay bale, cleaning his revolver by lamplight. He seemed to be keeping watch, and the realization brought tears to her eyes, tears of relief, of gratitude, and of a longing so profound it frightened her. The weeks stretched into 2, then 3. Wade found reasons to stay on. A broken plow that needed fixing, a well that needed cleaning, fence posts that needed replacing. Frank, seeing the improvements to the ranch, grudgingly agreed to each extension, especially when Wade accepted payment in meals rather than cash. What Frank didn't see or chose to ignore were the small moments between Wade and Willow. The way Wade made sure to be working near the house when Frank rode out. The quiet conversations as Willow hung laundry and Wade repaired nearby outbuildings. The books Wade lent her, novels and poetry he carried in his saddlebags that gave her a glimpse of worlds beyond her own. Most importantly, Frank didn't notice how his own behavior changed with Wade's constant presence. He still drank, still cursed and complained, but he no longer raised his hand to Willow. Whether from pride or some primitive recognition of Wade as a physical threat, Frank kept his violence in check. One afternoon in late June, while Frank was in town on business, Willow found Wade repairing the garden gate. She brought him lemonade, lingering as he drank it. "My father built this gate when we first came here," she said, running her fingers along the weathered wood. "He had such hopes for this place." Wade looked up, surprised. "This was your family's land," she nodded. "My father homesteaded it when I was just a girl, built it up into something special." Her voice softened with memory. "He died 6 years ago. Influenza took him and my mother both in the same winter." "I'm sorry," Wade said. "Must have been hard losing them so young." "It was," she agreed, sitting on a nearby stump. "I was 18, suddenly alone with all this." She gestured to the ranch around them. "Frank was working as a hand for the neighbors then. He was kind to me in my grief. Offered marriage, promised to care for the land as my father had." She laughed bitterly. "I was so naive." Wade set down his tools, giving her his full attention. "You were young and grieving. We all make choices we'd take back if we could." "What about you?" she asked. "Any choices you'd take back?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Too many to count," he finally said. "But a wise man once told me we don't get to change our past, only our future. My future feels fixed," she said quietly. Wade moved closer, kneeling in front of her so their eyes were level. "It doesn't have to be, Willow." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it sent a shiver through her. "What do you mean?" she whispered. You could leave, he said simply. Start fresh somewhere else. She shook her head, fear closing her throat. I can't. This land is all I have left of my family and Frank. He'd find me, he'd. I wouldn't let that happen, Wade said, his voice low and fierce. The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine it riding away with Wade, leaving behind the fear and pain, starting anew, but reality crashed back quickly. He's my husband, she said, standing abruptly. For better or worse, remember. I don't recall for bruises and terror being in those vows, Wade replied, standing as well. Willow, I've seen what he does to you, what he would have done that first night if I hadn't knocked on your door. She turned away, hugging herself. Why did you come here, Wade? Really? He was silent so long she thought he might not answer. Then, I heard about Frank Jensen in town, about how he treats his wife, about how no one does a damn thing about it. Willow felt her cheeks burn with shame. So I'm some kind of charity case, some damsel for you to rescue. No, he said firmly. You're a woman who deserves better than fear, and I'm a man who couldn't ride away knowing what was happening here. He stepped closer. I've seen too much violence in my life, Willow. Done things in war I can't undo, but this stopping this kind of wrong, this I can do. Before she could respond, the sound of hoofbeats announced Frank's return. Wade quickly picked up his tools, and Willow hurried back to the house, her mind spinning with Wade's words. That night, as a summer storm rolled in from the mountains, Frank's mood darkened with the sky. He'd had another losing streak at cards, and this time, the whiskey didn't dull his anger, it sharpened it. You've been mighty friendly with that hired hand, he accused as lightning flashed outside the windows. Seen the way you look at him. I don't know what you mean, Frank, Willow said, trying to keep her voice steady as she cleared the dinner dishes. Mr. Evans has been a help around the place, that's all. Don't lie to me, Frank shouted, sweeping his arm across the table, sending plates crashing to the floor. You think I'm blind, think I don't see you mooning after him like some lovesick girl. He stood, advancing on her, and Willow backed up until she hit the wall. Outside, thunder cracked violently. Frank, please, she begged. You're drunk. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying, he growled, gripping her shoulders and shoving her hard against the wall. You're my wife. Mine. And I won't have you disrespecting me under my own roof. His hand closed around her throat, and panic surged through Willow as her breath was cut off. She clawed at his wrist, her vision starting to blur at the edges. Suddenly, the door burst open, rain and wind whipping into the room. Wade stood there, drenched and dangerous, his revolver drawn and pointed at Frank. Let her go, he commanded, his voice deadly calm above the storm. Now. Frank's grip loosened in shock, and Willow gasped for air, sliding down the wall as her knees gave out. This ain't your business, Evans, Frank snarled, though he took a step back. Made it my business when you put your hands on her, Wade replied, not lowering his gun. Mrs. Jensen, are you all right? Willow nodded weakly, one hand at her throat where bruises were already forming. Get out of my house, Frank demanded, reaching for the rifle mounted over the fireplace. Wade cocked his revolver. I wouldn't. Frank froze, his face contorted with rage and fear. You can't come into a man's home and threaten him. There are laws. There are also laws against beating your wife, Wade countered, though they don't seem to matter much in these parts. He glanced at Willow. Mrs. Jensen, I think it would be best if you packed a few things and came with me. She's not going anywhere, Frank shouted. That's her choice, Wade said evenly, his eyes never leaving Frank. But if she stays, so do I, right here between the two of you. Willow looked between the two men, Frank, red-faced and shaking with rage. Wade, calm and resolute, water dripping from his hat onto the wooden floor. In that moment, Something inside her that had been bent and nearly broken for 3 years finally straightened with determination. She rose to her feet, steadying herself against the wall. "I'll get my things," she said quietly. Frank lunged toward her, but Wade was faster, stepping between them and pressing the barrel of his gun against Frank's chest. "Don't," Wade warned, his voice low. Frank's eyes darted between Wade's face and the gun. Whatever he saw there made him back down. "Fine," he spat. "Take her. She's been nothing but trouble anyway." Willow moved quickly to the bedroom, grabbing a carpet bag and filling it with essentials: a change of clothes, her mother's silver hairbrush, the few pieces of jewelry she'd inherited, and the small amount of money she'd managed to hide away over the years. Her hands trembled, but her mind was strangely clear. When she returned to the main room, Frank had slumped into a chair, a bottle in his hand and defeat on his face. Wade stood vigilant by the door, rain still pouring outside. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Wade nodded, not holstering his gun until they were outside on the porch. The rain had slackened to a steady drizzle and lightning flickered in the distance. "My horse is saddled by the barn," he said. "Can you ride?" "Yes," she replied, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I grew up on horseback." They hurried to the barn where Thunder waited, already saddled. Wade quickly secured her bag, then helped her mount, swinging up behind her in one fluid motion. His arms came around her to take the reins, his chest solid and warm against her back. As they rode away from the ranch, from the only home she'd ever known, Willow expected to feel grief or fear. Instead, with each hoofbeat taking them further from Frank, she felt something unfamiliar unfurling in her chest: hope. They rode through the night, the storm clearing to reveal a sky dusted with stars. Wade kept them moving at a steady pace, taking little used trails through the pines. He seemed to know exactly where he was going, and Willow didn't question him, trusting completely in a way she hadn't trusted anyone in years. Near dawn, they reached a small cabin nestled in a stand of aspen trees beside a clear stream. It was simple but solidly built, with a stone chimney and a small corral for horses. "Where are we?" Willow asked as Wade helped her dismount, her legs stiff from the long ride. "Old Trapper's cabin," he replied, leading Thunder to the corral. "Friend of mine lets me use it sometimes. We're about 15 miles from town, but off the main trails. Should be safe here for a while." "Safe," she repeated, testing the word like an unfamiliar taste. "Do you think Frank will come after us?" Wade unsaddled the horse, considering he might. "Men like Frank don't like losing what they consider theirs, but I don't think he has the spine for a real confrontation." He looked at her seriously. "Either way, I won't let him hurt you again, Willow. I promise you that." She believed him. Despite knowing him for only a few weeks, she trusted Wade Evans more than she'd trusted anyone since her father died. The cabin was dusty but otherwise clean inside, with simple furniture: a table and chairs, a cast iron stove, a narrow bed in the corner, and shelves stocked with basic provisions. Wade lit the lantern and stoked a fire in the stove while Willow explored the small space. "You should rest," he said, gesturing to the bed. "I'll keep watch." She hesitated, suddenly aware of their situation alone together, far from town, the impropriety of it all. As if reading her thoughts, Wade added, "I'll stay outside on the porch. You'll be safe here, Willow, in every way." Relief and something like disappointment mingled in her chest. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." He nodded, tipping his hat before stepping outside. Willow sank onto the edge of the bed, exhaustion hitting her in waves. She should feel scared, she thought. She'd just fled her home, her husband, everything familiar. Instead, she felt lighter than she had in years, as if she'd set down a burden she'd carried for so long she'd forgotten the feeling of being without it. She lay down, not bothering to undress, and fell into the deepest sleep she'd had since her wedding day. When she woke, sunlight was streaming through the cabin's small windows. For a moment, she was disoriented, panic rising as she tried to place herself. Then the events of the previous night came rushing back, and she sat up quickly. Wade was at the stove, his back to her as he stirred something in a pot. He'd removed his duster and hat, and she noticed for the first time the breadth of his shoulders, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "Good morning," he said without turning, somehow sensing she was awake. "Coffee's hot if you'd like some, and there's stew." Willow smoothed her hair self-consciously and moved to the small basin of water he'd left on the table, washing her face and hands. "What time is it?" "Just past noon," he replied, glancing at her with a small smile. "You needed the rest." She touched her throat, wincing at the tenderness there. Wade's expression darkened as he noticed the gesture. "There's witch hazel in my saddlebag," he said. "Might help with the bruising." As they ate the simple meal, seated across from each other at the small table, Willow studied Wade openly for the first time. In the daylight, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the way his green eyes shifted between serious and warm in an instant. She guessed him to be in his early 30s, though the war had likely aged him beyond his years. "What happens now?" she asked finally. Wade set down his coffee cup. "That depends on what you want, Willow." "What I want?" The question surprised her. No one had asked what she wanted in so long. "Yes," he said simply. "This is your life, your choice." She looked down at her hands, considering. "I can't go back," she said firmly. "Not to Frank, not ever." "All right," Wade nodded. "Then we need to think about what comes next. You could file for divorce on grounds of cruelty, though that's a difficult path. Or," he hesitated, "or," she prompted. "Or we could leave this territory altogether. Make a fresh start somewhere Frank couldn't find you, California maybe, or up to Oregon." The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. "I don't have much money," she admitted. "Just what I managed to hide away, about $30. "I've got savings," Wade said. "Enough to get us wherever you want to go." "Us," she echoed, her heartbeat quickening. Wade met her eyes steadily. "If you'll have my company, I won't presume anything, Willow, but I'd like to make sure you get settled safely at the very least." "Why?" she asked, the question that had been burning in her since he first arrived at her door. "Why would you do all this for a stranger?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I had a sister once," he finally said, his voice low. "Younger than me. While I was away fighting, she married a man who—" He swallowed hard. "By the time I got home, it was too late. He'd beaten her so badly she didn't survive the night." Willow covered her mouth, horror washing through her. "Wade, I'm so sorry." "I found him," Wade continued, his eyes fixed on some distant point. "Made him pay for what he did. It didn't bring Caroline back, but I swore then I'd never stand by again if I could help it." He looked back at her. "When I heard about Frank Jensen in town, heard what he was doing to his wife while the whole town looked the other way, I couldn't ride past. Not again." "So I remind you of your sister?" Willow asked softly. Wade shook his head. "No, what you make me feel is different entirely." He stood abruptly. "I should check the horses. We'll need to move on soon in case Frank decides to come looking." He left the cabin, leaving Willow to absorb his words. "What you make me feel." The implication sent warmth flooding through her, a feeling she'd almost forgotten: desire, attraction, the simple thrill of being wanted for herself, not as a possession. Later that afternoon, they packed what supplies they could and saddled the horses Thunder for Wade, and a gentle mare named Willow that Wade had apparently acquired in town before their escape. "You named your horse after me?" she asked. surprised as he told her the mare's name. Wade smiled sheepishly. Seemed fitting somehow. She's got the same quiet strength about her. The compliment made her flush with pleasure. They rode west, keeping to trails that Wade said weren't frequently traveled. He seemed to know the land intimately, guiding them through forests and across streams with confidence. "Where are we heading?" Willow asked as they made camp that evening in a sheltered grove. "There's a small settlement about 2 days' ride from here," Wade explained, building a small, nearly smokeless fire. "Friend of mine runs the general store. We can rest there, get supplies for a longer journey if that's what you decide." "If that's what I decide," she repeated, smiling slightly. "You keep saying that as if my opinion matters." "It does matter," Wade said seriously. "More than anything." They ate a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, and Willow found herself telling Wade about her childhood on the ranch, the happy years before her parents died, the dreams she'd once had of making the place thrive. "I wanted to raise horses," she admitted. "Beautiful, fast horses that people would come from miles around to buy. My father taught me everything he knew about breeding and training, but after he died and I married Frank." She trailed off. "Dreams can be postponed," Wade said gently, "not forgotten." As night fell fully, the question of sleeping arrangements presented itself. Wade solved it simply by spreading his bedroll several feet from hers, close enough for safety but with a respectful distance between them. "Good night, Willow," he said, tipping his hat before settling down. "Good night, Wade," she replied, watching the firelight play across his features until sleep claimed her. The next day brought them through increasingly rugged terrain. Wade explained they were taking a circuitous route to avoid possible pursuit, though he doubted Frank would venture this far from his whiskey and card games. By midday, they had climbed high enough to look back over the valley they'd left behind. Willow reined in her mare, gazing at the distant smudge that was Genoa. "Having second thoughts?" Wade asked quietly, stopping beside her. "No," she said firmly. "Just saying goodbye, I suppose." He nodded understanding, and they continued on. That night, as they made camp in a small canyon, a distant rumble of thunder warned of approaching weather. Wade worked quickly to create a shelter, using a tarp from his supplies and the natural overhang of the canyon wall. "Should keep us dry," he said, as the first fat raindrops began to fall. "Might be close quarters, though." The storm arrived with startling ferocity, wind driving the rain nearly horizontal. They huddled under the makeshift shelter, their shoulders touching as they watched the downpour. "Will the horses be all right?" Willow asked, concerned for the animals tethered nearby under a stand of pines. "They'll be fine," Wade assured her. "Horses are tougher than people give them credit for." Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating the canyon in brilliant white for an instant. Willow instinctively pressed closer to Wade, and his arm came around her shoulders, steady and comforting. "I used to be afraid of storms," she confessed. "Not the thunder or lightning, but what they meant. Frank was always worse during bad weather, as if the storm fed something dark inside him." Wade's arm tightened slightly. "You're safe now," he said, his voice a rumble she could feel through his chest. She turned her face up to his, their features barely visible in the darkness. "I know," she whispered. The air between them seemed to change, charged like the storm around them. Wade's hand came up to gently touch her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone. "Willow," he said, her name like a prayer on his lips. "I don't want you to think." She silenced him by placing her fingers against his mouth. "I know what I want, Wade," she said, surprising herself with her boldness. "For the first time in years, I know." She leaned forward, replacing her fingers with her lips, kissing him softly, tentatively. Wade remained still for a heartbeat. then responded with a gentleness that brought tears to her eyes, so different from Frank's rough demands, so careful of her consent and comfort. When they parted, Wade rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since I first saw you," he admitted. "Even with my bruises and fear?" she asked. "Especially then," he said. "Because even through all that, I could see the strength in you, the fire that hadn't gone out, just been banked for a while." She kissed him again, deeper this time, her hands sliding into his hair as his arms encircled her. The storm raged around them, but within their small shelter, they created a different kind of tempest, one born of long-denied desire and newfound freedom. They didn't go further than kisses and gentle touches that night, both aware of the rawness of Willow's emotions, the need to move slowly after her years with Frank. But as they lay side by side, Wade's arm protectively around her waist, Willow felt a peace she hadn't known was possible. "Wade." She whispered into the darkness. He murmured sleepily. "Thank you for waiting, for not giving up on me." His arm tightened around her. "I'd have waited forever if that's what it took," he said simply. The next day dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed the world clean. They continued their journey, riding side by side now, their conversations flowing more easily. Wade told her more about his life, his childhood in Colorado, his time in the war, the wandering years after his sister's death. "I never stayed anywhere long," he explained. "Always felt like I was searching for something, though I couldn't have told you what." "And now?" Willow asked. He looked at her, his smile warming his entire face. "Now I'm thinking it might be nice to put down roots again, in the right place, with the right person." By late afternoon, they reached the settlement Wade had mentioned, little more than a cluster of buildings around a crossroads, but a welcome sight after days on the trail. The general store stood at the center, a two-story building with living quarters above the shop. A burly man with a magnificent red beard stepped out as they approached, breaking into a wide grin at the sight of Wade. "Well, I'll be damned. Wade Evans back from the dead," he boomed, striding forward to clasp Wade's arm as he dismounted. "Not dead yet, Samuel," Wade laughed. "Though not for lack of trying." Samuel's eyes moved to Willow, his expression curious but kind. Wade helped her down from her mare, keeping a supportive hand at her waist. "Samuel Anderson, meet Willow Jensen," Wade said. "Willow, this is the friend I told you about. Saved my life at Shiloh and never let me forget it." "Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Jensen," Samuel said, his sharp eyes taking in her fading bruises and the protective way Wade stood beside her. Understanding dawned in his face. "You both look like you could use a hot meal and a real bed. Martha." He called over his shoulder. "We've got company." A plump, pleasant-faced woman appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. Her welcoming smile mirrored her husband's. "Wade Evans, been too long since you darkened our door." Within minutes, they were ushered inside, fussed over, and seated at a table laden with more food than Willow had seen in months. Martha Anderson, with the intuition of a woman who had seen much in her life, asked no prying questions about Willow's situation, instead treating her like a long-awaited guest. After the meal, while Samuel showed Wade to the stable to tend to the horses, Martha led Willow upstairs to a small but comfortable bedroom. "Bath's drawn for you in the washroom down the hall," she said, patting Willow's hand. "Take your time, dear. Fresh clothes on the bed there might be a bit loose, but they're clean." Willow blinked back tears at the simple kindness. "Thank you, Mrs. Anderson." "Martha, please," the older woman said, "and no thanks needed. Any friend of Wade's is family to us." She hesitated, then added gently, "Whatever brought you here, whatever you're running from, you're safe now." The bath was heavenly, the first real one Willow had had since leaving the ranch. As she soaked in the warm water, She examined her body, the fading bruises on her wrist and throat, the older scars from years of Frank's abuse. For the first time, she didn't feel shame when looking at them, only a fierce pride that she had survived, had escaped. When she emerged, dressed in the borrowed clothes with her hair damp around her shoulders, she found Wade waiting in the hallway. He'd bathed as well, his hair still wet, wearing a clean shirt that must have been Samuel's, though it strained somewhat across his broader shoulders. "You look beautiful," he said softly. "I look like I'm wearing a tent," she laughed, gesturing to the oversized dress. "Still beautiful," he insisted, offering his arm to escort her downstairs. That evening, after Samuel and Martha had retired, Willow and Wade sat on the store's front porch, watching the stars emerge above the small settlement. Wade had just finished explaining that they were safe here. Samuel had sent word to the sheriff, a friend who understood the situation and would ensure Frank couldn't cause trouble. "So, we have time to decide what comes next," Wade concluded, his hand resting lightly over hers on the porch railing. "I've been thinking about that," Willow said, "about what you said before, California or Oregon. And I think I'd like to go north," she said. "I've heard there's good land in Oregon for raising horses." She looked at him uncertainly. "If that's something you'd be interested in." Wade's face broke into a smile that made her heart skip. "I can't think of anything I'd like more," he said. "But Willow, there's something I need to ask you first." He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "I know this is fast. I know you're just beginning to find your freedom again, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Willow Jensen. I think I loved you from the moment I saw you in your kitchen, trying so hard to be brave." Tears filled her eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "Wade, let me finish," he said gently. "I want to build a life with you, a real partnership, not the mockery of marriage you've known. But I'll understand if you need time, if you want to establish yourself independently first." If this time she silenced him with a kiss, pouring all her newfound courage and hope into it. When they parted, she smiled through her tears. "I love you too, Wade Evans. And I don't need time to know that." He pulled her close, his arms strong around her, his heartbeat steady against her ear. "Then let's go build that horse ranch," he murmured into her hair. "Together." 2 weeks later, they stood before a justice of the peace in a town more than 100 miles from Genoa. Willow had filed for divorce on grounds of cruelty, and while it would take time to finalize, the sympathetic judge had assured them it would be granted. In the meantime, they exchanged simple vows, pledging themselves to each other with Samuel and Martha as witnesses. Willow wore a new dress of pale blue, her hair adorned with wildflowers Martha had helped her gather that morning. "I, Wade, take you, Willow," Wade said, his voice clear and certain as he slid a simple gold band onto her finger. "To be my partner in all things, to honor and cherish, to protect and respect for all the days of our life together." "I, Willow, take you, Wade," she responded, her own voice strong and sure as she placed a matching band on his hand. "To be my partner in all things, to honor and cherish, to support and respect for all the days of our life together." The justice pronounced them husband and wife, but it was the words he added after that brought fresh tears to Willow's eyes. "What has been joined here is not ownership, but partnership. Not subjugation, but mutual respect. May your union be blessed with the equality and dignity all marriages should aspire to." That evening, as they prepared to leave the Andersons and begin their journey north, Samuel pressed a letter into Wade's hand. "Cousin of mine in the Willamette Valley," he explained. "Says there's a parcel of land available near his place. Good water, good soil, perfect for horses." He winked at Willow. "Told him to expect new neighbors soon. As they rode out the next morning, Willow felt none of the fear that had accompanied their flight from Genoa. Instead, each mile brought increasing excitement about the future they were building together. "What shall we name it?" Wade asked as they stopped to rest the horses beside a clear stream. "Our ranch, I mean," Willow considered, watching a pair of butterflies dancing above the water. "New Dawn," she said finally, "because that's what you gave me, Wade. A new beginning." He leaned over to kiss her softly. "New Dawn it is." The journey to Oregon took nearly a month, following the trails that would eventually become more established routes west. They traveled carefully, but without fear, stopping in small towns along the way to replenish supplies and occasionally taking odd jobs to supplement their funds. In one such town, as Wade helped repair the local livery stable, the owner mentioned a mare for sale, a beautiful black thoroughbred with a white star on her forehead. Well bred, but considered too spirited by her current owner. "Perfect foundation for a breeding program," Wade told Willow that evening. "If you think she's worth the investment." The next day, Willow spent hours with the mare, recognizing in the horse's fieriness a reflection of her own rediscovered spirit. They purchased her with most of their remaining savings, naming her Libby short for Liberty. "First member of the New Dawn herd," Willow said proudly as they continued their journey, Libby following obediently on a lead rope. When they finally reached the Willamette Valley in early autumn, the land took Willow's breath away, rolling hills covered in grass so green it seemed almost unreal, stands of tall fir trees providing natural windbreaks, and a clear creek running through the property Samuel's cousin had described. "It's perfect," she whispered, standing on a rise overlooking what would become their home. "Better than I ever imagined." Wade slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "Just needs a house," he said, gesturing to the cleared area near the creek. "And some fences, stables, a barn." She laughed, leaning into him. "Is that all? We'll build it together," he promised. "Every bit of it." And they did. Through that first winter, they lived in a small cabin they constructed with help from neighboring settlers. By spring, Wade had built a proper stable for their growing herd. Libby had been joined by 2 more mares and a stallion, the beginnings of Willow's breeding program. As the years passed, New Dawn Ranch flourished. Willow's expertise with horses proved valuable in the growing territory, and by their 5th anniversary, they had a reputation for breeding some of the finest riding stock in Oregon. Their home grew too from the original cabin to a comfortable 2-story house with a wide porch where they often sat in the evenings, watching the sunset over their land. And their family expanded as well, with the arrival of a son they named Thomas, after Willow's father, and 2 years later, a daughter they called Caroline, honoring Wade's sister. One evening, as they sat on that porch watching 7-year-old Thomas teaching little Caroline to pet a new foal, Willow leaned her head against Wade's shoulder. "You ever think about it?" she asked softly. "How different our lives might have been if you hadn't knocked on my door that night?" Wade's arm tightened around her. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I look at all this," he gestured to their children, their home, the thriving ranch around them, "and I can only be grateful that I did." Willow turned to face him, cupping his beloved face in her hands. The years had added silver to his temples and deepened the lines around his eyes, but to her, he was more handsome than ever. "Thank you for waiting for me," she said, echoing words she had spoken years ago in a makeshift shelter during a storm. "For giving me the time and space to find my courage." Wade smiled, the same smile that still made her heart race. "I'd have waited forever," he replied, just as he had then, "but I'm awfully glad I didn't have to." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Willow Jensen Evans looked out over the life she had built with the man beside her, a life of partnership and respect, of shared dreams and mutual support, of love freely given and joyfully received. It was everything she had once thought impossible, everything she now knew she deserved. And as Wade's lips found hers in a kiss as tender as their first, Willow knew with absolute certainty that this moment, this man, this life was what true freedom felt like. In the years that followed, New Dawn Ranch became one of the most successful horse breeding operations in the Northwest. Willow's expertise and Wade's steady management created a legacy that extended far beyond their property lines. Their horses were sought after by everyone from local farmers to wealthy businessmen in Portland and Seattle. Their children grew strong and confident under their parents' loving guidance. Thomas inherited his father's quiet strength and his mother's affinity for horses, while Caroline showed a spirited independence and a keen mind for business that would eventually complement her brother's skills perfectly. News reached them occasionally of Genoa and Frank Jensen. He had lost the ranch to gambling debts within a year of Willow's departure, and had drifted west, working as a hired hand until his drinking made him unemployable. The last they heard, he had died in a barroom brawl in some mining town, alone and forgotten, a fate that Willow received with neither joy nor sorrow, but merely a quiet acknowledgement that justice sometimes worked in its own way. On their 20th anniversary, Wade surprised Willow with a gift that brought tears to her eyes: the deed to her family's original homestead in Nevada, purchased quietly through an agent when it came up for sale. "I don't expect you'll want to live there again," he said as she traced the familiar boundaries on the yellowed map. "But I thought perhaps Thomas and Caroline might like to know where their mother came from, that it's part of their heritage too." Willow embraced him, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "We'll visit in the spring," she decided. "Show the children where I grew up, the good parts before, Wade agreed, understanding as always. "And then we'll come home again." Home. Such a simple word for something so precious. As Willow looked around at the life they had built together, the thriving ranch, their beautiful children, the community they had become an integral part of, she marveled at how far she had come from that frightened young woman trapped in a cycle of abuse and fear. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Willow and Wade sat before the fire, sharing a rare moment of solitude. "You remember what the justice of the peace said at our wedding?" Willow asked, her fingers intertwined with Wade's. "About partnership and equality." Wade nodded, bringing her hand to his lips. "I think about it often. I've been thinking," she continued, "about all the women who are still where I was, still trapped, still afraid." "You want to help them," Wade said, not a question but a recognition. "I do," she confirmed. "I've been corresponding with a women's aid society in Portland. They're establishing a network of safe houses, places where women can go when they leave dangerous situations." She looked at him uncertainly. "I thought perhaps we might offer New Dawn as one of those places. We have the room, especially now that we've expanded the east pasture." Wade's face broke into that smile she still found irresistible after all these years. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he said. "New Dawn living up to its name, a fresh start for those who need it most." Willow leaned against him, gratitude and love washing through her. "How is it you always understand?" "Because I know your heart," he said simply. "And it's the most beautiful thing I've ever known." Over the next decade, New Dawn Ranch became known for more than just its horses. Through carefully guarded channels, women found their way to the Evans homestead, women with bruises visible and invisible, women seeking escape from situations much like the one Willow had fled. They stayed for weeks or months, helping with the ranch work as they healed, learning skills that would help them build independent lives, finding their strength in the supportive community Willow and Wade had created. Some moved on to cities or other settlements, while others stayed in the area, becoming part of the extended family that gathered for celebrations and supported each other through hardships. As Thomas and Caroline grew to adulthood, they embraced their parents' legacy. Thomas, with his quiet competence, took over much of the horse breeding operation, introducing new bloodlines and expanding their reputation even further. Caroline, fiery and brilliant, managed the business aspects and became increasingly involved in the women's aid work. Her mother had pioneered, eventually helping to establish legal protections for abused wives throughout the territory. On Willow and Wade's 40th anniversary, a milestone few had expected Wade to reach after a serious bout of pneumonia. The previous winter, their children organized a celebration that brought together friends and family from across the region. The ranch yard was decorated with paper lanterns and wildflowers, tables laden with food prepared by neighbors, music provided by a local string band. As the sun began to set, Thomas called for everyone's attention, raising a glass toward his parents where they sat together, gray-haired but still strong, still clearly in love after 4 decades together. "To my father," he began, his deep voice carrying across the gathering, "who taught me that real strength lies not in domination but in support, in knowing when to stand firm and when to yield, when to protect, and when to step aside and let others find their own power." Caroline stepped forward to stand beside her brother. "And to my mother," she continued, "who showed us all that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the determination to act despite it, who transformed her own pain into compassion and created a legacy of hope for countless women who followed in her footsteps. To New Dawn," they finished together, "and the light it has brought into so many lives." As cheers erupted and glasses were raised, Wade turned to Willow, his green eyes still bright in his weathered face. "Did you ever imagine, that night we rode away from Genoa, that we would create all this?" he asked, gesturing to the celebration around them, the thriving ranch, their children and grandchildren. Willow shook her head, leaning to kiss him softly. "I only knew I wanted to be free," she admitted. "Free to love, free to dream, free to become whoever I was meant to be." Wade's arms encircled her, still strong despite the years. "And who was that?" he asked. "Who were you meant to be, Willow Evans?" She smiled, looking out over the gathering at Thomas with his arm around his wife, at Caroline deep in conversation with a young female lawyer from Portland, at the women who had found sanctuary at New Dawn over the years and now returned as friends and equals. "Exactly who I am," she said with quiet certainty. "A woman who waited for the right moment to claim her freedom. A woman who found the courage to ride away from fear toward love. A woman who built something that will outlast her, something that matters." Wade rested his forehead against hers, the gesture as intimate now as it had been when they shared their first kiss during a thunderstorm decades ago. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered. "So grateful for every day we've had together." As darkness fell, and the lanterns cast their golden glow over the celebration, Willow Jensen Evans looked at the man who had waited for her, who had seen her strength when she couldn't see it herself, who had offered his hand not to lead but to walk beside her. "Thank you for knocking on my door," she said softly, words she had repeated many times over the years. And as always, Wade's answer remained the same, spoken with the same conviction as the first time. "I'd have waited forever, but I'm awfully glad I didn't have to."